Hey art nerds, today we are doing a tutorial using Crayola Supertips to paint a super cute girl. So the materials are pretty simple. You're going to want a pack of Supertips. I also used a pack of Sharpie brush liners to ink this. I used white gouache to add the highlights, and I'm working in a Canson XL watercolor sketchbook. You're also going to want a watercolor palette or a white ceramic plate, as well as a couple of synthetic watercolor brushes. So these are the materials that we're going to be using today. I picked up this 100 pack of Supertips a few years ago from Walmart. They still sell them and they're about $15, so they're very affordable. I've also got two synthetic brushes. One is a Princeton Round and the other is a Jerry's Artorama Mimic. And then finally, we have a Canson XL watercolor sketchbook, and I went ahead and I did my sketch using colored lead. And I used Color Eno colored lead, but you could use color pencils if you wanted, or you could use some of the other mechanical pencil colored leads that are on the market. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm selecting the colors, the base colors that I want to use for this piece. And since we have a lot of hearts and it's a very cute piece, I'm going to go with a lot of pinks. And I'm going to go ahead and swatch them so I know exactly what colors I'm getting. Crayola Supertip caps are usually not indicative of the color that's actually inside the marker. So swatching not only helps you figure out what colors are in the marker, but it helps you figure out what color palette you're going to use and eliminate colors that won't work. So I applied some of my Supertip, one of my very light pinks, directly to a ceramic plate from Dollar Tree. I'm going to use this as my palette. I also have a cup of clean water off to the side, and what I'm doing is I'm applying it like it's a watercolor marker. So I put the marker down on the ceramic plate first, and then I pick it up using a very wet brush and I paint it on. So one of the cool things about Crayola Supertips is that they can double as a very inexpensive watercolor marker. It's one of my favorite secret art hacks. And it's a great way to really get the most out of these inexpensive markers. It's a fairly humid day in Louisiana, so I used a couple of bulldog clips to clip my book shut. You could also use binder clips, and I also used a piece of tissue paper to wipe down my plate so I have a clean surface. After my first layer had a chance to dry fully, I'm going in with the same color directly and hand drawing little hearts in the background. Next, I applied a darker pink to my ceramic plate palette, and I'm picking it up with a brush. We're going to be using this technique a lot for this tutorial. It's a really great way to get lighter tones of your marker and kind of extend your color range. Although the 100 color set has a lot of great colors, it doesn't necessarily have a lot of pastels or a lot of lighter skin tones. So this is a good way to get some of those. And you don't have to use a ceramic palette. You could just use a scrap piece of plastic so long as it's non-porous and fairly shiny. It'll work pretty much the same way. So now I'm working with a next darker color and I'm filling in the larger hearts. And I'm going to use this to help me build up that color. Once those had a chance to dry, I went in directly with the marker, filling in most of the marker, and then I'm going to use, filling in most of the heart, and then I'm going to use one of my synthetic watercolor brushes to kind of blend that out a little bit. I have no affiliation with Crayola, but I really love introducing people to some of the things that Crayola Supertips can do because they're such an affordable marker and they're really very flexible and you can find them just about anywhere. So whether you live in a big city where you have access to all kinds of art supply stores or a really small town in rural Louisiana, you can still find Crayola Supertips, and you can also find them on Amazon. I'll have a link down in the description below if you want to order through my affiliate link. These do not have any fumes. They're easy to clean up. They come in a lot of really bright colors, and it's very easy to do watercolor techniques with these markers. So for younger artists or for artists who might have strong smell sensitivities or might be kind of concerned about working with alcohol markers, water-based markers like Crayola Supertips are a really great, very affordable alternative that will allow you to achieve bright, colorful, fun art with it. So I'm just using a scrap sheet of paper as a blotter to protect the paper from my hand and to also prevent my hand from picking up some of the marker and transferring it to other parts of the drawing. Starting with a clean plate, part of the Clean Plate Club, I apply some of my lighter skin tone directly to the plate and pick it up using a wet synthetic watercolor brush to paint onto her skin. And I know it's difficult to see, but I'm trying to leave the white of the paper as some of my highlight. Now, those of you who frequently watch my channel might remember my Arteza Twi Markers Unbox and Swatch and watercolor tutorial. And in that video, I strongly recommended that you guys try Crayola Supertips or the Kuretake Zig Clean Color Real Brush instead of the Arteza Twi markers. And after I did that, I decided I wanted to do a tutorial where I show you guys how to use Crayola Supertips to do a piece very similar to the piece I did with the Twi markers, just to show that you can use something that costs literally less than half the price. You get twice as many and you can achieve very similar effects. Something else I want to point out about the Supertips is that on this Canson XL watercolor paper, you can apply the marker in layers directly on top of each other and it's not going to tear up the paper the way if you were to use Supertips in, say, a sketchbook or on drawing paper, it would start to tear up the paper. When I recommend to parents to get a watercolor sketchbook for their kids, the reason I'm recommending a watercolor sketchbook is it tends to be great for all media. And I know there's sometimes a bit of a challenge to get kids to use something that's seen as fancy, but they're going to get more use out of something that can take whatever they throw at it than something that tears up and abrades and the colors don't really work right and it bleeds through the paper. So this is why I really recommend going with a watercolor sketchbook. And you can get the Canson XL watercolor sketchbooks just about anywhere, from art supply stores to Michael's to even Walmart. So once my first layer dried, I applied a layer of Supertip, that light skin tone color, directly to her skin. And I'm blending it out using a wet watercolor brush just to kind of soften the transition and to get a nice mid-tone. Supertips don't have a blender marker. You could use a Tombow ABT blender marker or an Ecoline blender marker. Any water-based markers blender would work for that because it's just water and glycerin. You can also just use water like we're doing here. It's a very affordable way to kind of achieve this technique. And I've also applied some of my darker skin tones. So I selected 2 Caucasian skin tones for this piece. And I'm also applying that to the palette and then painting it onto her skin. Now, I'd also applied a bit of a warm pink and applied that to her cheeks and her lips using the watercolor brush. And I applied a very light blue to my plate and painted that into her eyes. It was a little bit too dark, so I lifted it up and I applied it again. Now I'm going back in with that darker skin tone color, particularly on the arm that's kind of behind her, to add more shadow. And I'm adding it on the front arm as well, just to add a little bit more definition. Now, something you guys might not have noticed is when I was painting that first layer of skin tone, I also painted it under her sleeves. I want her sleeves to be transparent. By doing this, I'm kind of establishing our base color. And that's going to make painting the transparency much easier. I'm also going in on her face and adding shadow directly, particularly underneath her bangs, on the tops of her eyes, underneath her nose, underneath her lip, and on the insides of her ears, as well as underneath her chin. For her eyes, I applied a very light green. I wanted to create kind of a contrast pop. And then I went in with the marker directly once it dried and did another layer of it. Then I went in with a slightly darker blue-green just to add some shadow to the eyes. So you guys can see we've got 2 colors there to kind of give the eyes a bit more depth. So I've selected some purples that I want to use for her hair, and I'm going to apply the first one directly to our ceramic palette. And you don't have to just use that center circle, you can also use the rim. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to build up the color in her hair, to build up the contrast, so we're not just limited to our 3 colors, we can go much lighter. Now, Supertips, once you've applied them directly to your paper, they can be reactivated with water. So layering them using a watercolor technique is a bit of a challenge. It does take some getting used to, but this can be used to your advantage as well. You can use this to help clean up areas, rework areas, fix areas, or even use it to kind of loosen up the piece with spatter techniques. So I'm painting that lightest purple into her hair, leaving lots of highlights. I also use that same purple as a base on her top and on her leggings. Now I'm going in with the same blue-green I used for her eyes, and I applied it directly to our ceramic plate, and I'm painting it in so that we can get a really light color and build up that transparency effect. Something else with Supertips is that almost all of the colors in the Supertip line are very saturated. So by using this watered down watercolor technique, you can adjust your saturation. So some areas can have more saturation than others, which is going to help you develop contrast and interest. If everything's the same tonal value or the same saturation, it becomes very fatiguing for the eyes and it can get kind of boring. I'm also applying this green to the little hair bobbles in her hair. So once her hair had a chance to dry, I'm going to go in directly with our lightest purple. You can see there's quite a difference in shade between the purple that we painted on and the purple that goes on directly. And I'm using that blotter piece of paper again just to protect the paper. So with Supertips, depending on your working situation, I do want to point out I was working on the floor, sitting cross-legged, completely leaning over to record this. So it's absolutely not the ideal situation to be working in, but if you were sitting at a desk and you were comfortable, I would recommend that you turn the paper frequently in order to get the best angle, and that you do most of your color application using the broader side, and then kind of edging towards the tip of the marker in order to get those finer lines. And if you're in a better working situation, you could use these to kind of ink your piece, to kind of draw your outlines around the figure once you're finished with it. That is not a route I chose to go, but it is definitely an option, and it would mean you'd need fewer materials. Now, while that first layer is still kind of wet, I'm going in with my second layer, my darker purple, and I'm developing and building up contrast by this layering. What going in while it's still kind of wet creates a softer transition, a softer blend. If you wait until it's fully dry, you're going to get a stronger delineation with stronger contrast. Now for her shirt, I want it to be much darker purple than her hair. So I did apply a base color just to kind of establish our color. Now I'm going in with that medium purple and just kind of filling the whole thing in, leaving some highlights. And when you're working with Supertip, since it's not a brush tip marker, you need to be really cognizant. You need to really think about the kind of strokes you're making and the kind of marks you're making and really use that to your advantage. Otherwise, it starts to feel like you're just using or just coloring a coloring book. So as you're working on this piece, as you're rendering your piece, just kind of think about how you're holding the marker and what you're doing with the marker. So while I wait for that top to dry, I'm going into the green part of her shirt, the transparent part of her shirt, with that lighter blue-green marker. And in some areas, I'm just kind of outlining it, like with her sleeve, but with her collar and with the main body of the shirt, I'm applying it and then blending it out using a little bit of water. I also want you guys to notice on the sleeves, I'd reapplied the skin tone directly, and that kind of helps give the impression that these are transparent sleeves because you can see some of the skin through it. Now for her skirt, I'm doing a pretty direct application using the side of the Supertip, as you guys can see here, to cover large areas as quickly as possible. And I'm not really concerned about streaking on watercolor paper because watercolor paper is really absorbent. Streaking is going to be less of an issue because you can apply more layers. So once that had a chance to dry and my camera had a chance to recharge, I'm going in with the darker of the blue-greens and adding stronger shadows to just help establish the lighting. One of the things I noticed from more novice artists, younger artists, is that there just isn't enough contrast and light. The shadows aren't getting dark enough and the highlights aren't light enough. So don't be afraid to really kind of work it and to add more shadows to try and make it just a little bit darker. That's really going to help develop the forms so people can actually tell what you're rendering so things don't feel so flat. For her bubble skirt, I went in with that darker green and really started rendering the shadows so you guys could see that it was a gathered bubble skirt. So for her leggings, I wanted to leave them pretty light, which would again be contrasting to her hair and the purple on her bustier. So I really just worked on rendering the shadows on her stockings rather than filling things in and coloring things in. And for the waistband on her skirt, I decided to go with a lighter blue color, the sort of color that I used on the shadows of her eyes. Color theory is something that I sometimes struggle with, so I try to have kind of limited palettes. When I was younger, I used to think a color palette was every pastel color all together, which kind of contradicts what I said earlier about saturation and building up contrast. So now I try to kind of limit my palettes. I'm also drawing little hearts directly in the background using some of the colors that we'd used previously in this piece. So I'm going in right now and doing little blue hearts. And coloring in the inside of her mouth using red. And I just went directly in with the Supertip, and then I went in with a darker red just to kind of build up that shadow. And now I'm going into the background and doing little purple hearts, and I'm just going to kind of do that with all the colors that we used in this piece. So at this point, I want to kind of liven things up. So I created a mask using just a scrap sheet of paper, and I'm flicking clean water onto the piece. And what that does is it kind of activates the water in the Supertips, and it makes it move around, and it also pushes some of the color out, leaving little white spots. And I mask areas that I don't want affected by that. So we started with her full body, and then we protected just her face. And what this does is it kind of gets the colors moving around a little bit and can liven things up if things start to feel too static. So next I want to ink this piece. Originally I was going to use the Sharpie fine liners that you guys can see here. And the reason I went with those is just because there's something that can be found at most Walmarts. And they're pretty accessible for most people. To be fair, they're not my inking material of choice. I'm going in with just a really dark purple, the darkest purple I can find, and adding in some further shadows to her hair as well as to her stockings, just to kind of add some additional delineation. Now, if you want to ink a piece like this, I would actually recommend you go, my personal preference are brush pens. I really like brush pens, but you could pick up a pack of Sakura microns, the multicolor Sakura microns from like Michaels. Those would work really well for this kind of piece. Or you could pick up some of the Tombow Furenosuke brush tips. Those are what I used on the Arteza piece, and I really like them. But I only brought the Sharpies with me because I wanted to review them. And I've had them for a couple of years, and I'd never used them. This is actually the first time I'd used them. And they'd already started to go dry, and the colors were going kind of muddy. So if you're the sort of person who hoards your art supplies, hangs onto your art supplies for a rainy day, for just the right piece, let me tell you guys, art supplies can go bad just like food can go bad. Use them, enjoy them. You're going to be a stronger artist for it. Don't just hoard them. So I switched over to the Sharpie brush markers, and those had some hard start problems. They were also new old stock in that I bought them a couple years ago and I hadn't used them because I wanted to review them. They're fiber tip brush markers, kind of similar in terms of tip to the Pitt brush pens. So the brushes themselves aren't that bad. It's just that they'd started to dry out and they'd started to die. And I'm still sitting hunched over on the floor. So what I did for this piece is, for each color I chose, like I used a pink to ink her skin, I used a blue for her eyes, I used purple for her hair, I used green for her skirt. I inked just a little bit for you guys to get the idea of what color I'm selecting. And then I stopped the camera, I inked the whole piece in a different position that was more comfortable for me, and then I resumed the camera. So this isn't actually a full inking demo, it's just me inking bits and pieces so you guys can get the idea. And the reason I inked it is when you ink, you're actually adding additional contrast and you're tightening up the piece. So if your work is a little bit too loose, if it's hard to understand, or if it feels a bit disjointed, inking it can sometimes help pull a piece that you don't like together. Like that Arteza piece, for example. Before I inked it, I really didn't like it, but inking it kind of made it cohesive and made it pull together, and I like it a lot better now, so much so that I made this as kind of a companion piece to it. So these are the colors that I used to ink this piece. Next, I'm just going to use a little bit of white gouache to add highlights. White gouache is a thick opaque watercolor. You could also use a white gel pen. You could use white paint, like white watercolor paint, mixed really thickly. You could use a little bit of white acrylic. You're not limited to using just white gouache. That's just my preference. And I'm using a really fine synthetic brush. This is a little Cotman brush, just to add highlights to her eyes, to her hair, to the baubles, just kind of adding additional contrast. When we add these white highlights, that's also adding contrast because that's adding the whitest highlight to the piece. So this is what the piece looked like before we inked it. It's cute, but it definitely could be pulled together. It's a little too light and airy. And it was done almost entirely with Crayola Supertips with a little bit of color pencil underneath for your underdrawing. I would recommend you not sketch your piece with graphite that can ruin your super tips. And this is the piece after we've inked it. You guys can really see it kind of comes together and the inking really pulls the piece into a hole. And if you want, you could use your super tips or even the Crayola super fine tip markers to ink your piece, or you could use brush pins or technical pins. I would recommend not using ballpoint pins just because those tend to not want to go over things that have a lot of layers already applied. But I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful, useful, and informative. I do have other water-based marker tutorials here on this channel. They're great for younger artists, artists on a budget, or artists with sensitivities. Now, just like alcohol markers, Crayola Supertips are dye-based markers, so please don't display your art in full sunlight because it's not going to stand the test of time. It's not archival, and it will start to fade. So if you want your art to really last, store it behind UV glass or store it in kind of a darker room. If you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me in the comments or through my Discord channel, The Paint Box. You guys can find a link to that in the description as well. Or I will also have links to my Patreon, which allows me to continue doing the work I do here on YouTube, as well as some of my other art resources, both here on YouTube and over on my blog. I really enjoyed making this tutorial for you guys. I hope it inspires you to use what you already have at hand or what's really accessible for you to make some beautiful art. And that's just me kind of going through all the materials that we use for this. Anyway, I hope you guys have a great day, and I hope to see you guys again really soon. Make sure you hit subscribe for more art tutorials just like this one. Bye, guys!